First up is Sinners, which is the latest film from Ryan Coogler. It stars Michael B. Jordan, Haley Steinfeld, Miles Caton, Jack O'Connell, Wunmi Mosaku, Jamie Lawson, Omar Miller, Lee Jun Lee, and Delroy Lindo. And I was traveling, so I did not get a chance to see an advanced screening of this film. And so it came out last week, and everyone was over the moon about it. And I was like, oh man, I have faith that this is going to be a good film, but can it live up to the expectations that everyone is hyping it up to? And I have to say, so I rushed out to a theater to see it as soon as I got back. And this is definitely worth seeing in a theater. I love that it has clearly done a ton of research on several of the components. It feels authentic, and it feels like everything is done with care. So the premise is two twins, played by Michael B. Jordan, return to their hometown in Mississippi in the 1930s to start up a juke joint. And also this is a vampire film, which, again, people kept talking about it being a vampire film. And for the first, I would say, almost 50 minutes of this film, I was like, did I misread or misremember that? But no. At the end of the day, it is a vampire film. So I think my biggest piece of feedback about this film, and again, I think it is a spectacular film, it's phenomenal, the performances are great, is that it takes a little long to get to the crux of the film, and we get a lot of intros that don't necessarily go as far as I'd like. It's 2 hours and 17 minutes plus 2 full-on credit scenes. And I'm like, ooh, there is a bit of setup we potentially could have saved. But once we get to the heart of the story and the heart of the community and the folks who are dealing with this existential threat, not only of vampires, but also living in the Jim Crow South, which blends themes together in a way that is very well crafted. By the time we got to that, I was like, oh, I think if we'd gotten here a little bit faster, I would have had zero complaints about this film. And not that that's a complaint per se, but I think a piece of feedback and something I experienced as an audience member. Again, I think this film is worth seeing in a theater. One, for the communal experience. I went to a 3 p.m. matinee on a Tuesday, and it was full of people, and it was hooting and hollering, and I was like, this is great. The sound mix, this movie is heavily reliant on the score, and also music is a huge component of the plot. That is worth experiencing in, full theater HD sound. And of course the visuals, this was shot for 70mm IMAX, which I know sounds gimmicky, but this is a film that deserves to be seen in theaters. And I don't always say that. I'm very mindful of, hey, it costs a lot of money to see a film, it costs a lot of time, all these things. But I know I am just adding to the choir of praise for this film. I will caveat, like I said, it runs a little bit long. I do wish we'd gotten to some of the crux of it a little bit faster. And also, I will warn, if you're a vampire purist, there are some questions to be had about the lore and the mythology and just how the vampires behave. The vampires, it's not a creature feature in the same way that, other ones are, in that we don't care as much about how the vampires are created and what they're, like a Count Dracula or, all that stuff. That's not, or Nosferatu. That's not what this film is. But if you are somebody who immerses yourself in that culture, you'd be like, why are they doing this? And why can't they do that? And, it's a minor piece of feedback. Again, much like the runtime, I still had a great time at this film. I cried, I laughed. The performances are phenomenal. Again, from a cultural perspective, you can feel how much authenticity and how much they cared about authenticity. Also, huge shout out for just the Asian representation, because I talked about this in our roundtable. I feel like there's a lot of Asian erasure in American history where it's we were in the Mississippi South Delta in the 1930s. We're not necessarily the main characters of that time frame because there's other things going on, but we played a part in it, right? Or the construction of the railroads, or just there's a whole thesis to be written about this. But anyway, as a film, Sinners was a great experience. I highly recommend it. I don't want to super overhype it, but I'm also fully all in on you should definitely go see this in a theater. The runtime and a couple of the plot holes around some of the lore are the only reasons I'm knocking a tiny bit of percentage off, but great film, worth seeing. 4.8 out of 5 for me. The next film I have is The Accountant 2, and while academically, I know I saw The Accountant, I cannot tell you anything about it, except for I vaguely remember Ben Affleck plays a character who is a savant, I think maybe through acquired means, I can't remember, but he is both a whiz with numbers and also somehow a super special forces level trained gunman, fighter, etc. So there we are. This film, to its credit, does not require or expect you to remember anything or just what I outlined. It only needs you to remember that from the first film. We pick up, I guess, sometime after the events of the first film, and this time it is Ben Affleck and John Bernthal plays his brother, and they have to go on a mission together. Cynthia Addai Robinson, who I guess was in the first one, again, a lot of this is just like, I got nothing. And I don't care. That's the other thing. This film did not make me care. The first film clearly didn't make me care. I feel like The Accountant 2 was an excuse, one, for Ben Affleck to make some cash money to pay off maybe like divorce or whatever it is, which fine. You know what? Do what you gotta do. But also for just middle-aged men to parade around in like their underwear and go like, we're still fit. Look at us. And I went, okay, if you need that sort of reinforcement in your life, I don't know if it needs to be in movie form. The other thing is, the bits and pieces I do remember from the first one are he was much more reliant on his like mental skills versus his shoot 'em up skills. And I feel like in this one, they just went, oh yeah, we need to acknowledge once or twice that he is a genius or is super capable in certain fields, but mostly we want this to be a shoot 'em up. And so in that sense, it becomes even more generic than at least the first one was, because the first one had a mild additional conceit to it. But this one, they're like, yeah, we'll acknowledge this like 2 or 3 times. But aside from that, let's have these two guys just be action heroes, which is, if I had my pick of people to watch as action heroes, it would not be these two. That's a personal preference. I know they both have fans, have fun. This is just a by the numbers, literally, action film. It doesn't have anything particularly special to offer, I think. Also, in terms of the action itself, it is not necessarily anything particularly innovative or creative. There's plenty of films like a John Wick or a Bullet Train or Fall Guy. Any of these films that are very action heavy are reliant on at least creativity when it comes to that type of choreography and staging, etc. This doesn't even have that. So if you're a fan of either of the main actors, I think you will enjoy this film because they are not high on my register of actors who I'm like, yes, I will go see a film for you. In fact, they are very low or prohibitive or sometimes making me not want to see a film in any way, shape, or form. This was not a great experience for me. And again, because the plot was pretty generic and uninteresting and, again, very hand-wavy in times in terms of logic, it just wasn't for me. I am going to give this a 2.5 out of 5. The next thing I have is a series, and it is Andor Season 2. And this is one of those ones where I'm like, I don't need to tell you to watch this because, not to build into the hype again, I want to be mindful of that, but no, this is an excellent season of television. It has a painful level of poignancy. It is bleak and beautiful and depressing and dramatic, and even though if you've seen Rogue One, you know how this all ends, it's still worth going on this ride. Shout out to Diego Luna, but also shout out to Genevieve O'Reilly, who plays Mon Mothma. I think she just goes above and beyond this season. I will say there are 12 episodes of it, and like Sinners, my one critique is there are a couple of pockets in the season where it feels like we're going on a little bit of filler, or where, I think we could have done it in 10 if we'd shaved little bits and pieces from places. The key parts of this are so well done, and it is almost depressing to watch now from a perspective of like, oh, this is an allegory for previous wars versus feeling more like it is a warning of things to come again in a much sooner timeline than any of us would like. So in that sense, it's brilliantly done, but oh my God, a bummer. I think this season feels even more intense in a way, and maybe it is just because of like the geopolitical climate it's coming out in, all this stuff, but I don't recall there being a lot of humor and levity in the first season, but any of that is pretty much gone in this season. I think the most we get is like the dynamic between Kyle Soller and Denise Gow's Empire characters. But if you are a Star Wars fan, I know you're already watching the show. I know you're already 3 episodes in. If you are like an on the fence casual fan and you're like, oh, I don't want to watch all the Star Wars series, Andor is without question the best of the streaming series. I love my Grogu and Mando stuff, but this is what art and entertainment is, and also political commentary. So huge shout out to Andor Season 2. It's coming out in 3 episode batches, so it's really only like a 4-week season, which is pretty intense, honestly. It's a brilliant watch. Get on it. The next film I have is called On Swift Horses. This is a film that I feel like maybe if it had come out 10 years ago, it would have felt more progressive and exciting. Right now, it kind of feels a little, all right. Like, the acting, I think, does a considerable amount to save this film. So it stars Daisy Edgar Jones, Jacob Elordi, Will Poulter, and Diego Calva, and Sasha Calle, and Daisy Edgar Jones is married to Will Poulter's character. His brother is Jacob Elordi, and I hope I'm not giving too much away, but I do think this is pretty well covered in like the trailers and stuff like that. Some people are hiding their sexualities / exploring their sexualities, but aren't out because this is taking place like during the Korean or right after the Korean War. So not exactly accepting time of queerness. And I think a couple of the flags are, it is one of those movies where I'm like, oh, you have a bunch of straight people playing gay or bi or pan people, which is, I'm like, is this an opportunity that could have gone to an actor who actually identifies as such? At least I think all of them are straight people. If they are not, they're not necessarily as out about it. And it shouldn't matter in terms of acting, but in terms of opportunities, it's hard enough for performers in the queer community to get roles. And usually they get pigeonholed into queer roles. So the fact that these queer roles are being given to, as far as I can determine, straight actors, it's a little like, ugh, but at the same time, you're like, oh, it's good to see that they are not shying away from roles that are inclusive of this. So it's one of those like complicated issues. Again, I think everyone acting-wise does a good job in this, even though it's only 2 hours. It did feel a little bit long and a bit repetitive, and you get kind of frustrated at the characters at a certain point. But like I said, this feels like maybe even 20 years ago, if this had come out, it would have been like Brokeback Mountain levels of revelatory. Even 10 years ago, when we had films like Carol coming out, it feels more like it belonged in that era, in that like this is somewhat tread territory and it's not necessarily adding to the complexity of the situation, but I will say it's not detracting from it, right? So it's just kind of in this like neutral ground where I'm like, oh, this is a film I watched. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. So overall, I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5, but it's not one, unlike Sinners, where I'm going to be like, oh my God, you have to run to the theaters. This is actually one where I think, you could potentially wait till it's out streaming on home entertainment. The last film I have is called The Legend of Ochi, and I saw the trailer for it, and I was so excited because it looked right up my alley. And then upon watching it, it didn't quite meet my expectations of what I was hoping for. So the premise is it takes place on this remote island, and everyone is terrified of these creatures that inhabit it, and so they're constantly hunting them or on the search for them. And the leader of the anti-Ochi, which are the creatures movement, is played by Willem Dafoe. Again, I love Willem Dafoe, so I was like, yes, I'm here for this movie. It also stars Finn Wolfhard, Emily Watson, and Helena Zengel. And the thing I will give a compliment to is I love a practical forward film. So the Ochi creatures, especially the baby one, who is effectively our protagonist, and gets separated. And so it's about Helena's character, Yuri, trying to potentially reunite this creature who she thought was a monster and to be feared with its family. Yay, naturalism, etc. I love the baby. The baby is so cute. I like the adult versions of this species as well, but the baby is very clearly, intentionally supposed to be adorable and appealing, and I think they did a great job with that. The obvious comparison here is going to end up being E.T. We find a creature, we got to hide it, other things want it, yada, yada, yada. And so because it's following that formula so closely, but also neglecting to enhance it, it actually kind of feels like, I hate to compare them almost, but like The Accountant 2 in the sense of it's very paint by numbers. You've seen it before, you've seen it with different components, but you've seen it done a lot better. And so while I'm not like this was a terrible movie, I did find myself not as enamored of it as I'd initially hoped based on the trailer. I think the trailer also does a better job of cutting. Very rarely am I like, the trailer is better than the film, but I think the trailer painted a picture of a more whimsical and joyful film, and the lore that they create in this just, it's only an hour and a half movie, and yet it felt longer. Which is kind of problematic since my critiques of the other films this week has been like, oh, it could have been a little bit shorter. I'm like, this is clocking in at what I think is usually a pretty healthy runtime for, attention spans. And yet I found myself not as engaged as I was hoping I would be, which is a shame because, again, technically it's an original film. Although, like I said, very E.T. inspired, which many, of these, like, we found a creature films are. The baby Ochi is adorable. I think the actors are fine. Willem Dafoe is in that kind of, like, manic Willem Dafoe stage. I feel like it's like he was given the direction to be in maybe a Wes Anderson film, but it's not a Wes Anderson film. And nobody else is in a Wes Anderson film, but like a mania version of a Wes Anderson film. So, end of the day, kind of a bummer. Like, I really wanted to be like, this is the most cute movie ever. And I think it is gonna be another one where I say you could wait till it comes out on home entertainment, which I'm sorry to say, but if you had to pick one film to spend your money on this week, I'm saying absolutely go see Sinners. I'm gonna give The Legend of Ochi 2.9 out of 5, just because I didn't feel an emotional spark with this film, and I think I was inclined to, and so if I'm not feeling it, then I think it's gonna be even harder for broader audiences.